The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Welcome to this session of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where we will start by looking at the forced transfer of Ukrainian children by the Russian Federation. Thank you to our three guests. If I can ask you to each introduce yourselves. Mykola, if we can start with you, please.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great privilege to participate in these hearings, and it's very important for us because more than 1 million Ukrainian children after the last 10 years live under the Russians. And I am a former presidential commissioner for children's rights with the two presidents. And now I'm a founder and CEO of Save Ukraine Rescue Network, which is the biggest organization who provide evacuation children and women from combat zones. And we are the biggest network who are returning kidnapped children from Russia and occupied territories. And just 2 hours ago, we returned 3 more children. 2 of them are orphans from occupied territories. And just 3 days ago, it was 10 children. And together, now it's 264 children who've been returned by Save Ukraine for the last 1.5 years.
Thank you, and thank you ever so much for the work you're doing to bring children home. Dr. Yulia.
Hi, it's an honor to be here. I'm Dr. Yulia Ioffe, and I'm a lecturer at University College London. And I've been researching forcible transfer of children in the last 2 years.
Thank you so much, Shahida.
I'm Shahida Tulaganova. I'm a filmmaker. I've been covering the war in Ukraine since 2014. And I am a producer director of the film Ukraine's Stolen Children, about the forced deportations.
Thank you. Mykola, if I can start with you, can you set out the scale of this forced transfer? I prefer to call it kidnapping. Forced transfer sounds something rather bureaucratic. And what the process is in which children are being taken from Ukraine to Russia.
Yeah, thank you. And you can hear different data, and about 20,000 children who've been identified as the stolen children. And you can hear a number 744,000 children who've been registered. It is stated of Maria Lvova Belova, Putin's commissioner, who received warrant order from International Criminal Court just 6 months ago. She stated that it's more than 700 children, Ukrainian children, who've been registered in Russia. And you can hear another data that more than 1 million children, as I told you in the beginning, who stayed in Russia and occupied territories. It's different data because nobody knows the real numbers. It's estimated because I've been a presidential commissioner and I monitor situation after the first invasion. And I knew how many children lived in Crimea and Donbass. We can calculate that now for the last 10 years, it is more than 1 million children. It's close 1.5 million Ukrainian children who stays in Russia and occupied territories. But how many of them unaccompanied, nobody knows. And many of them, maybe all of them, received Russian citizenship because it's impossible to live in Russia or even on occupied territories without Russian citizenship. That's why when Russian authorities reporting that we are not adopting Ukrainian children, it's true because first of all, they give them Russian citizenship and then they adopting Russian children. And what about these 20,000 identified children? Because we cannot tell you about that more than 1 million children, how many of them unaccompanied, how many of them are orphans or received orphan status, or where are they? Because we did not receive any information from Russians. But what we know, and it is evident for us, that thousands of young adults who are Russian soldiers now and fighting with us, they are former Ukrainian school children. And now many of them, as the as a captured Russian soldier sitting in Ukrainian prisons. And we now have access to have interview with these young adults, and they are reporting us they are former school Ukrainian children from Donbass and Crimea, and we have no evidence how many thousand of them died on the battlefields, because it is a strategy of Russia how to this strategy from several different steps. First, it's to kidnap or forcibly deport families with children to Russian Federation. It threatens them on occupied territories. It's instill hatred, or first brainwash and then instill hatred towards Ukraine, and weaponize and use these children as a soldiers.
And Mykola, I think Royston's going to bring you back to that, some of that shortly. Yulia, can I ask, you've classified the forced displacement of Ukrainian children into 4 categories. Can you talk us through those?
Thank you. Well, now I added one other, so there are 5 categories at least, which I identified so far. There may be more. So first category is transfers of children from occupied Ukrainian state institutions. So these are children in orphanages, boarding schools, and even hospitals that were in occupied territories. Just to clarify, children in Ukrainian orphanages and boarding schools, most of them are not true orphans. So these children do have family members in Ukraine. They were still forcibly transferred to Russia. And similarly, in hospitals, those were regular children who happened to be under treatment, for example, in hospitals, and who were also forcibly transferred. The second category are children who temporarily traveled to so-called holiday camps, so re-education camps, and I think Mykola mostly works with returning this category of children. The third category are children that are forcibly removed during the filtration process. So filtration process is a compulsory screening process, in a way an internment camps that Russia puts the Ukrainians in, and in this process children are separated from parents. However, Russia doesn't give any access to international organizations or any monitoring bodies, so we don't know how many children were separated in this way, but the assumption is that such children are in thousands. The fourth category are children captured in the battlefield, and we have now evidence this happening, for example, in Mariupol, in Melitopol, where children, for example, were lost during armed conflict, during hostilities, or their parents died and they were forcibly transferred. And the last category are forcibly transferred children who are accompanied, so where children were transferred with their families, but all of them didn't want to move to Russia but were forced to do so.
Thank you. Before I move Henry on to how we get them back, Shahida, I'd be interested in your work. Have you been looking at how Belarus might be playing a role and how many children you believe have been kidnapped?
Well, Belarus does play a big role in deportations of children, but they are not really kidnapping them. What happened since 2014, actually this is a very long story, children from occupied Ukrainian territories were taken to Belarus for some sort of re-education camps or relaxation camps. They started with disabled children first, and then they proceed to the children, healthy children from currently occupied territories. It is done together, it's done upon the order by the President of Belarus, Lukashenko, as well as with participation of Belarusian Red Cross, and the thousands of Ukrainian children be taken to these re-education camps where they're subjected to very brutal propaganda, including things like Biden die, Zelensky die, Putin is our president, just very simple example of that. After this re-education, they go back to their occupied territories, but however, we don't know if they're taken to these camps with the parental consent or not.
That's helpful. Thank you, Henry.
In the forced deportations, Yulia, what is Russia doing, if anything at all, to help facilitate return? And more importantly, what are they doing to obstruct return of children to Ukraine?
Thank you for your question. Generally, Russia frames these practices as evacuation. Generally, under international humanitarian law, evacuation is possible, but it should be temporary. Unfortunately, it is not, in fact, temporary. So what Russia is doing, first of all, and Mykola already mentioned this, President Putin adopted a decree in 2022 that accelerated adoption of Russian citizenship to Ukrainian children. They are also adopted by Russian citizens. Russian citizens are provided with additional financial help if they adopt Ukrainian children. They're also provided with ideological education. So additionally, children are separated from their families. Some children's, their names are changed. There are reports of children being dispersed intentionally throughout the Russian territory, so their families couldn't connect with them and reunite with them. There is also a significant element of indoctrination, so re-education, where through school curriculum, which is in Russian language, Russian school curriculum, there are also patriotic classes, even military training, where Ukrainian children are re-educated and convinced that they're not Ukrainian, but they're in fact Russian, and Ukraine doesn't exist, and everyone who thinks that there are Ukrainians, there are Nazis. So in this way, Ukrainian children are permanently settled in Russia.
I'm interested in something you said just a few moments ago. There's evidence that older abducted Ukrainian children not only being indoctrinated, but also potentially being used for military service on behalf of Russia.
Yes, so it does seem to be the case that military training component is present throughout the education efforts of Ukrainian children, but there seems to be a more significant element of this with older children, especially boys. There are reports of military programs in these re-education camps, particularly in occupied Crimea and in Chechnya, where children or boys at risk are taken to these military camps where they are taught to handle weapons, do proper military training, and unfortunately then, as Mykola mentioned, conscripted to the Russian army. And from what I understand, it is even for children, for boys who are 17, 16, it's quite difficult to collect them from Russia, even if there are family members who are ready and able to go and take them back, because Russia is very hesitant to let go of this particular category of children.
Excuse me, please, can I add something? It is obligation for every school child on occupied territory and in Russia to attend military movements. It's a different movements under the Ministry of Defense. It's even, they have Wagnerionok movements. It's Wagner Group movement for children, and the soldiers from Wagner Group should come to school children and tell them stories and involve them to different military movements. Yeah.
Has there been any evidence of those Ukrainian older boys, young men, after military training by Russia, then being deployed against Ukrainian forces?
Yeah, we have now cases, and we investigating and have interviews of young adults in Ukrainian prisons who've been captured as the Russian soldiers, and even some of them don't want to come back to Russia, don't want to be changed. They want to stay in Ukraine. They're very afraid to come back. And these young adults, they've been Ukrainian school children from Donbass.
Thank you. Sorry, Yulia, you want to come?
No, if I might clarify, also conscription of Ukrainian children and Ukrainian citizens to fight against their own people is a separate war crime. And unfortunately, this already happened also in occupied territories in Donbass, not only with children, but just citizens who were there and who were conscripted to the Russian army.
And Shahida, what do you think that the UK could be doing more to address this issue and help the return of those abducted Ukrainian children.
Before I go there, can I please add something on indoctrination in military training? There are two important components. First of all, Russia's youth movement called Young Army, which is militarized, and children from the occupied territories are particularly encouraged to enter this young army movement. And secondly, Russians, a very powerful investigative committee, which is under Ministry of Interior, set up a number of cadet schools, which includes indoctrination as well as training them to be future Russian investigators. And children, especially orphans from occupied territories, as well as socially deprived families, are very encouraged to send their children there. So we're creating a new army of absolutely loyal Putinists among all these children. Now, coming to the question about the UK's help and international help in general, I think there should be a process established of returning these children, because I don't know what Mykola is going to add to this, but at the moment it looks to me that everything is happening on ad hoc basis with the help of volunteers, but there is no coherent process of returning the children. Partly it's because Russian Federation is very reluctant to do that. The worst thing they do, they demand the Ukrainian side to present them the lists of all the children which they evacuated. However, it's the Russian Federation who has to present all this list, because Russia is a very organized country. Every single child who's brought to Russia is being registered, so everyone knows in Russia who is coming from which region of Ukraine. So if anyone should bring the lists in onto the table, is the Russian Federation. And then I think sanctions really don't work. I don't think Maria Lvova-Belova, and I met her personally in Moscow, really cares about this arrest warrant, because she is perfectly happy in Russia. She can travel to the countries which are not part of the International Criminal Court order. So I think more pressure, more sanctions on people who are around her, because it's not only her and President Putin who participate in the process. I think every single individual who is involved in deportations, including the governors of Russia's regions who adopt these deported children, including the State Duma spokesperson Anna Kuznetsova, as well as Tatiana Moskalkova, who is Russia's ombudsman for human rights, they all have to be at least also be given arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court. The more pressure, the better the result, because this is the only language Russia understands, the language of pressure and threats.
Thank you. Fabian.
And
thank you,
let me please
Mykola,
shortly inform...
Mykola,
yeah.
I think Fabian's going to come to you anyway, but I'm aware we've only got about 9 minutes left, so I'm going to bring in Fabian.
Okay.
Go on.
So Mykola,
hello
here. What kind of physical and psychological impacts do you think has forced transfer had on the children involved? That's
what we have from these children, but just a little what we learned from these children who've been returned. All of them are forced to listen Russian propaganda. It's a horrible propaganda about false narratives about Ukraine. They must speak Russian language, no Ukrainian language, Russian anthems, sing Russian songs, marching all times with the Russian songs, and all of them have psychological trauma. The forced displacement and abduction can lead to serious psychological trauma, including anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and because we have a network of Hope and Healing Center for these children and psychologists who are working every day with them, we can give you a clear report about what they're experiencing and how long the trauma healing courses they need. And it's horrible. We just returned one more child. It is an orphan, 14 years old girl, and she's been forced in Russian schools, and she's been punished there, and she has very bad condition now of psychological health. Yeah, that's why we can give you a report, because it's very limited time, and several stories what the children experience and their condition of health now.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
You want to keep going at all?
No, that's fine.
Brendan.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, so the legal aspect of this in relation to international law, and in what way is Russia violating international law through what it is doing, and what other, if any, aspects of international law are being violated on these children? What have they been exposed to that would be deemed to be a breach of international law?
Thank you for your question. So there are multiple provisions of international law that may be violated in this case. As I mentioned, particularly in international humanitarian law, provisions that limit evacuations. So those were violated, and this action could also constitute international crimes under international law, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So forcible transfer could be any of those crimes. So far, the mentioned ICC warrant against Putin and Lvova Belova concerns specifically war crimes, but it doesn't mean that these crimes couldn't be reclassified or additional charges added, because it is possible to also qualify those crimes as a crime against humanity because of systematicity of with which it's happening, and also even potentially genocide, which is quite difficult to prove in international law. But in my own work, I argue that this could constitute genocide because of the specific element of indoctrination and erasure of Ukrainian national identity. And in parallel, there are also obligations under international human rights law, particularly Convention on the Rights of the Child, and there are multiple provisions that are violated by this practice of forcible transfer, including particularly the right to identity under Article 8 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also a number of provisions that talk about family life, family unity, and family reunification. Those would be also violated in these cases.
And Shahida, very quickly, you touched on it earlier that what's happening in terms of sanctions and it's having very little impact on Putin and on Maria Lvova-Belova. To what extent has anything that the international community done changed what Russia is doing, or Russia's approach to what they're doing? Is it making any difference?
Huge. It's a huge difference, because if you monitor the trajectory of Russia's reaction to the deportation of children, in the beginning they made this whole PR for the domestic audience, saying, look, we're saving children from Ukraine. And they made it so public that it was all over Russian television. However, when they didn't move to actually start giving children back. However, ever since the international arrest warrant was issued, they are more willing to do so, even though they tried to make a lot of obstacles for the parents to go and pick up their children. They are not denying that fact, and they say that we're happy to give them back. So the pressure worked. So that's why I think more pressure, more children we're going to bring back. More likely Russia is going to be willing to move forward in releasing these poor kidnapped children.
Excuse me, please, but I'm not agree, Shahida, with you, because, yeah, on the one hand, it was in the beginning more pressure, and they stopped just showing brutally how they kidnapping children and indoctrinated them, but now they are blocking any opportunity or any tries to return these children back. 80% of relatives of mothers who, because only one way to go to Russia through Moscow, 80% of them are deporting. They not allow. And our last story, we just returned 14 years old orphan whose guardian, kinship care guardian tried to reach her, and she was stopped in Moscow. She'd been interrogated, and FSB detained her, and 2 days she'd been arrested, and now she banned to reach to the Russian territory for 20 years. For 20 years. Now Russia tried to hide any child, any information. It's very hard to find even information about these children, and that's why this action, these sanctions, just help us on the one hand, but on the other hand, Russia understand that they could be accused if they will give any information, and they trying very fast to brainwash child, to hide this child, to give this child to Russian orphanage or Russian family, and to not allow anybody to reach child there.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jim.
Can I just ask, none of you have mentioned the word genocide, but many people have said that the forcible transfer of children is a form of genocide. Dr. Yulia, I don't know if you want to kick us off on what the legal situation is.
Yes, I myself argue that this can constitute a genocide because of a special intent to destroy Ukrainian nation as a national group that is going on, but in international law, it is quite difficult to prove genocide specifically because of the special intent. In international jurisprudence, there haven't been a lot of cases that would concern specifically forcible transfer of children and were proven to be a form of genocide. However, I argue that because forcible transfer of children is not the only punishable act that could be that could constitute genocide that's happening in Ukraine, because there are also killings, targeting of civilians, bodily harm, sexual violence, and all of it, I argue, is a program to eliminate Ukrainian nation. And of course, indoctrination efforts, I think, are really important in proving that this may be genocide, because they are aimed at erasure of Ukrainian distinct national identity and Russification and absorption of these Ukrainian children into Russian society.
And Shahida, I'd welcome your view on that, but I'd also ask, why do you think we haven't seen a commensurate response with the genocide being conducted in Xinjiang, where we are seeing the same forcible kidnapping of children from their homes, children being sent to live with Han parents, children being sent away from theirs, again forced to learn a new language, to reject their own, to adopt new names? Why do you think there's more of a focus and people seem to be forgetting the Xinjiang, the children of the Uyghur who are going through the same process?
Look, I'm not a lawyer to talk about genocide. I just can collect the evidence. And I think the only reason people don't talk about Xinjiang and Uyghurs is because of China. Because when Russia is a bad guy, you don't want to have another bad guy over there being on the other side of the war. However, I think that the scale of persecution of Uyghur children and the scale of their deportations to Han Chinese schools and orphanages is much bigger than what Russia has done in Ukraine, which doesn't say that Russia is good. It's just the scale is different. And I think we need to bring up the story about the children, because the Uyghur children face horrific abuse, and their ethnicity is totally eliminated by Han Chinese. And I'm the person who is following the Uyghur case for a very long time, and it's just absolutely atrocious.
Neil?
Yeah, just a quick question to all of you. Is there any country, or are there any countries who are able to influence Putin or Russia more significantly to help with the reunification or return of the children?
Yes, there were a couple of successful cases. For example, Qatar mediated to return 4 children. From information available, also Saudi Arabia and Turkey are engaging in diplomatic efforts to return children, so potentially working through diplomatic channels with some of the non-European, non-NATO affiliated states to return some of the children would be a beneficial avenue.
But through the mediation of Qatar, it's been returned 30 children from 20,000 who've been identified. I don't think that it is effective role of any mediator. Yeah, and this coalition, new coalition, which was created with more than 30 countries, and they're trying to find mechanism how they could return, but not any international organization have no success now. Because first of all, we have to have access to our children there, just to try to talk with them, to ask them how they've been taken, from which territories, where they, what happened with them. But Russia not allow anybody. And in this case, Qatar case, it's not that children who've been kidnapped. That's stories of children, they've been divided from one parent to another parent. It's, for me, it's very simple cases. But I can tell you that we have success with any country, with any mediation. Yeah, that's why we have to try to find any mechanism. But Putin not allow anybody to have access to Ukrainian children, just to receive information.
So forgive me, Mykola, so the UN, the Vatican, the IRC, none of them have been able to effectively help get children back from Ukraine, from Russia?
No, we have no success with any of them. I'm telling you because all time we organize these rescue missions, and we are building a strategy, and we try and negotiate with the special services, with the different governments. Even now we have some tries with Qatar, but as for me, it's more about like political benefits. Yeah. It is not about real mechanism. It's about political benefits.
And Shahida, is there anything you want to say about the international community's efforts to reunify and bring children home?
I would agree with Mykola. It's about political benefits, because for Russia, these children are hostages, and they are keeping them as a trade, as a card for their negotiations. So I think that the way to take them out is not the mechanism, is some political decision of behind the curtains talking to the Russians and achieving some sort of deal, because they understand absolutely well that when they finally start releasing these children, we know the scale, and this is a war crime. Do they want to admit their own war crime? No. So maybe the political resolution of this issue is possible with negotiations with Russians behind the curtains. I don't know, but I would agree with Mykola's point.
Thank you. And Mykola, can I ask you, we touched earlier about how severe the indoctrination is and exactly what the Russians are putting these children through, which is, without question, mental torture, let alone physical torture for those who refuse to do what they are told. Are you, as a result, seeing some children come back to Ukraine being rescued who say they want to go back to Russia, that they didn't want to be rescued because so severe is the indoctrination?
Yeah, and just now with Shahida, we help one child who's been hugely brainwashed to return to his relatives in Germany. And this orphan child have been hugely brainwashed, and he glorified Putin, Russia Federation, and we have some video with him. We can only privately to give it to you, just you to understand what Russia's doing, because he's telling that it's maybe not it's a real war. I don't believe that Putin criminal. It's like, because he lived in Moscow in one Russian family. He received financial support from them. And all of that children who've been there, not all, but many of them have been brainwashed, because when you live in this huge propaganda, any of us, if we stay there a year or two, our brain will be changed. Yeah, that's why it's so hard to communicate with the children. They are really afraid just to think they could come back to Ukraine, or because they learn from Russian that Ukraine, it's Nazi state, and it's Ukraine together with NATO fighting with Russia, and we aggressors, and Russia is victim, and Russia is protecting their territory. These children are learning every day this in their schools. That's why it's so hard to communicate with them.
Thank you. I think it's hard for us sometimes to remember that some of these children were kidnapped more than 2 years ago, and that is how long they have been held, imprisoned. Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask you all, who do you think has the power internationally to do anything at all to respond to the forced transfer of children? Which countries, organisations are in the best position to do that? Shahida?
It's a very difficult question. I think The only countries which could influence Russia, unfortunately, are not West's friends. I'm talking about Iran and China. I don't think Putin will listen to any international organization. He successfully showed everyone that Russia does whatever Russia wants, and Russia is not going to be punished. If Russia wants, they will give the children back. If Russia doesn't want, they won't. So I don't think there is any international organization which Putin will listen to, but I would like to hear my colleagues' views on that.
To Yulia?
In my opinion, there should be a coordinated approach that is led by Ukraine. So Ukraine's Office of President started the campaign Brings Kids Back UA, which tries to engage international partners, states, international bodies. Again, this is only possible where there is a coordinated effort, and we've heard today that there are some issues with coordination. And I would argue, although I understand that my colleagues may disagree with me, I do think that additional arrest warrants and additional sanctions are helpful, especially with regard to not the leaders like Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, but just regular bureaucrats who participate in forcible transfer of children, because this is a huge industrial machine in Russia. The forcible transfer happens on all levels of the government, from Ministry of Education to just mayors of cities. So if these people are personally, for example, sanctioned, or there are arrest warrants with regard to them, and they can't travel for a vacation to Europe, I think that can make a difference.
Could China have any influence, do you think?
Of course, I think that there should be a coordinated effort. I don't think that just one sole thing would work. I think that a combination of strategies, including legal strategies, but also diplomatic, political efforts, and also sanctions, arrest warrants, and others would be, in combination, might be effective.
Mykola?
Yeah, many sanctions, more very strong sanctions. Russia not playing rules. They are playing games. They are not following rules. Because you are based on the legislation, and you cannot understand how they are not following rules. They are criminals. They never following rules. They will play games. That's why any international legislation doesn't work. They don't work with Putin, because they are using this only to break these rules. That's why we have to try to find another mechanism. We have to mount a pressure, very hard pressure on Russia, and just to show them that they must do this. If not, they will have serious troubles.
Russia is very dependent on certain countries for its supply, for its weapons, for lots of other products. Couldn't those countries have an influence if they were so minded on this issue of children? Anybody?
Yes, of course, they would be, but the issue is that was already raised with China specifically. They're doing similar things to their own population. So there is an issue with that, of course. And it is a political decision that is hard to influence, but I would just also make a comment on legal avenues and legal mechanisms. Potentially we don't see any outcomes right now, but hopefully in the future there'll be Russia without Putin and Belarus without Lukashenko, and there'll be new leadership, and this mechanism would be important for future resolution, for children returning back, documenting all these crimes, and potentially future reparations as well.
Can I add something?
Please.
There's only one solution, which is not that easy, is Ukraine's victory. If Ukraine's got enough weapons to fight Russia, we're not going to be sitting here talking about how the hell on earth we're going to bring these children back. We'll get these children back. So Ukraine needs military support, and this is the only way to resolve this issue. Otherwise, we're going to be fighting a very, very long war.
Well, thank you all. It is interesting, given that the ICC indictment for forcible transfer of children is one of the only things that seems to have impacted in any way meaningfully in Russia. So it is incumbent upon us to question the government as to why they have not done more following that indictment. Can I thank you all for the work that you are doing, whether it be shedding light on what is taking place or whether it be rescuing these children. And I wish you every success in your future, and I hope that we will hear many, many, many more coming home in the next few days and weeks. Thank you ever so much for your work. Order, order. We're going to suspend the session there.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, order. Welcome back to the session of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where we will be looking at sanctions, export controls, reparations, and the seizing of frozen Russian assets. Dr. Shagina, can you please talk to us about how effective financial sanctions on Russia really have been? Because this is an ongoing debate within Parliament. Are sanctions working, and should we be continuing with them?
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you for the second time. My name is Maria Shagina. I'm a senior research fellow at IISS based in Berlin. The question asked is really the evergreen question whether sanctions are working. And there are different ways to measure them. I believe it should start with the objective. By setting the objective, we can really understand whether we are moving towards this goal or not. The objective was not to collapse the Russian economy, but to gradually erode its ability to fund the war and to deprive the Kremlin technology that can enable the Russian war machine. There are three dimensions to assess this. First of all, we need to start with the design of sanctions. Quite often it's understood if there are sanctions, then we're talking about some sort of full embargo, which is clearly not the case. The sanctions are quite complex, but also the sanctions regime is embedded in very incremental approach, tightening sanctions here and there, but it's not a comprehensive approach of Iran or DPRK scale maximum campaign style. Also, Russia has adapted to some of the sanctions since 2014. It has a playbook how to counter some of the financial sanctions or export controls. So it has been preparing for some of them. And it's probably well-positioned country to tap into its former Soviet republics to establish routes and parallel supply chains to really source these critical items that are no longer available for the West. And finally, it's the position of these third countries that are not joining or reluctant to join sanctioning coalitions that the West has gathered here. So the position of China, the UAE, Turkey are really critical to look at whether they are complying with Western sanctions informally or formally, and how much they are helping the Russian war machine to withstand the storm of sanctions.
No, please go on.
Macroeconomically, obviously, Russia is doing well. That is this type of short resilience that Russia wants to sell, the narrative that the Kremlin has doubled down on. GDP is growing, unemployment is below 3%, the financial system did not collapse. And that is, again, due to rather skillful response from the central bank's technocrats who were ready to some of the sanctions, and also to, again, the position of third countries. But if we look behind the facade of this macroeconomic stability, the fundamentals of the economy are rather weak. The aerospace industry and the car industry have collapsed. Also, Russia's economic growth is mainly due to war spending, right? It's more than 40% now. For this year, more than $100 billion are prepared to be spent on. And this is easy, again, to sell how much Russian economy is doing well. Yet we're not talking about any innovation or capital inflows. It's rather the opposite, and brain drain is really has been aggravated since then. One sign here I think is important to watch is high inflation. The Kremlin has been quite careful in terms of hiding the effects of sanctions to pretend that nothing is being affected. But high inflation, which is now more than 7%, is something that is quite alarming for the Kremlin that is preparing itself for the presidential campaign.
And can I ask you, Professor Webb, given that sanctions are meant to be corrective rather than punitive, they're meant to force a country to change its position, given that we are not seeing any change in Putin's resolve, do you think that's why we're seeing so many discussions around seizing frozen assets, because people essentially have lost hope that sanctions will work?
Yes, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm, in addition to being Professor of Public International Law at King's College London, I'm the author of a report for the European Parliamentary Research Service on legal options for confiscation of Russian state assets to support the reconstruction of Ukraine. What I think we have here is both an opportunity and a problem, and solutions to that problem. We're in an almost unique scenario for a conflict where almost $300 billion worth of Russian central bank assets are frozen in foreign accounts as a result of these sanctions. The bulk are in Belgium, where Euroclear, the central securities depository, holds about $225 billion. So that's the opportunity, given that latest estimates are that the reconstruction of Ukraine will cost $486 billion. The problem is that these central bank assets enjoy a high level of immunity from enforcement or attachment under international law. And state immunity is one of the fundamental rules of the international legal order. It's not to be taken lightly. And the rationale behind that is that interference with the state's property constitutes an interference with its freedom to manage its own affairs. However, coming directly to your question, I think we've been in a state of collective freezing very effectively in terms of the coordination of that straight after the full-scale invasion in February 2022. But as we've heard from Maria, Russia has workarounds. We also have the building day-by-day needs of Ukraine and its people, and I see a momentum in Europe, in the G7, towards moving from freezing to some form of confiscation and transfer for Ukraine's needs.
That's very helpful. Can I just ask you then, can I take back to Iraq and Kuwait? So obviously the difference here is that we had a UN Security Council resolution, but I think it was 1993, you'll have to forgive me if it's the wrong year, but essentially a decision was made to essentially breach that idea of state immunity. So I know we don't have a UN Security Council resolution here, but there is precedent.
Not a direct precedent for exactly the reason that you've said. We had the UN Security Council action there, which is not possible due to Russia holding a veto, and it will exercise that veto if any similar action was taken. So that is not an exact precedent. The way the commission was set up, the way the distribution was done, the way it was a very rigorous process with different categories of claims can all act as a precedent. But the circumvention of immunity would require UN Security Council action, because under the UN Charter, all members are required to comply with such resolutions, and we just don't have that option here.
Thank you, Fabian.
Just very briefly, to follow on from what you said, Professor Webb, are you sympathetic to the view of certain Danish parliamentarians that actually to circumvent the immunity of use of those assets, to use them, even for a good purpose like rebuilding Ukraine, as a result of Russia's actions, would fundamentally go against international law and is something we shouldn't even contemplate?
I'm not in agreement with that position. I understand it because immunity is a high bar, but I believe that there are legally credible routes to getting around that immunity. So there are 6 options under consideration at the moment. These are actively on the table of discussions in the EU and the G7. The first is conditional countermeasures. That's where we break international law by transferring assets that would usually be subject to immunity, but we justify it as a valid countermeasure, which excuses wrongfulness under international law. That's very long-established law. The next 3 options are all being considered in Europe, and one of them has been adopted recently, which is the windfall tax. And they are all focused not on the principle, not on this 300 billion as such, but on either the net profits being made from it by the central securities depositories or the interest being earned on it. So they're looking at those smaller amounts and transferring those rather than the principle. And there's 3 variations on those proposals. The fourth option is that there are international cases against Russia brought by Ukraine in the European Court of Human Rights and in the International Court of Justice. The one in the European Court is of particular interest because it sets out all the human rights violations alleged against Russia, including the right to property. So that could lead to significant damages, and there is an exception in international law for enforcing against state assets when you have an international judgment, not a domestic judgment, an international judgment finding those damages. And the final option is to declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. This is a practice that has been used against some other states and Russia in the US and Canada. It's a very isolated practice, and I think that one has the least support under international law. But in going back to my first option, conditional countermeasures, if we can call it that, I think that is a very credible option under international law that would be viable.
Incredibly helpful. Thank you. Royston.
Thank you, Chairman. There's evidence that Russia is circumventing the G7 oil price cap, not least by using its shadow fleet. What additional compliance and enforcement measures are needed, do you think? Either or both of you?
So I think this might be a question more for Maria in terms of how sanctions implementation, but just to go back to the proposals that I've mentioned, the way to mitigate the losses through that would be to seize the principal assets that we already have within friendly jurisdictions. But I defer to Maria on the circumvention.
Yes, I think we need to start with the objective of the price cap, which has 2 goals. Sometimes they are contradictory. On the one hand, it is to encourage Russia to supply oil to the markets, and on the other hand, it's to slash its oil revenues. And so far, the emphasis was to avoid overcompliance, to avoid shortage on the oil markets. So the attestation process, the price cap mechanism has been rather porous and not very strong in terms of its enforcement. We've seen how Russia has created shadow fleet and diverted more than 80% of its oil to 3 countries. It's China, India, and Turkey. So what things can be done in terms of enforcing a price cap in a much more robust way? First of all, it's improving attestation process, right? The documentation needs to be stored for longer, also to avoid any falsification of the documents from the brokers and commodity traders. Second one is going after tankers. This is something that is already unfolding, and particularly from the US, where 27 tankers and shipping companies have been targeted. None of them have managed to dock any ports. I think there is only one that docked now in China, but the rest of them are floating at sea and can't find any future buyers. And also leveraging the remaining choke points. For example, the majority of Russian oil goes through European ports, that is the Baltic Sea primarily. So increasing the standards for insurance that is much more capitalized, doesn't come from dodgy companies, will be one way to make sure that Russia is still relying on G7 insurance, the key mechanism of the price cap. And also to avoid any environmental risks which come from these dodgy insurance companies. And finally, one way to go further is to lower the price cap. Russia has traditionally relied on oil revenues for the 40% for its budget. So that is the key area to focus on. Lowering it to 50% would already make a big deal. To 30 would even slash the revenue by 50%.
Can I ask about the cap and how Russia tries to avoid that by selling 80% of their oil to China, India, and Turkey? Are they paying higher than the price cap, and are they willing to do that? I mean, why would they do that?
So the story here evolved. Originally, it was the discounts between Urals and Brent was quite extraordinary, up to 40%. That is astonishing for energy markets, which usually enjoy a difference of $3. But with the price cap not being enforced in a robust way, that discount, the margin, has narrowed to 14% last year. Now with the US going after actors and facilitators who help Russia to avoid this G7 insurance as the key lever, we see again with the ramp up enforcement of the price cap, this discount has increased to 80%. And that is the whole idea behind the price cap. It would be impossible to create a watertight coalition since China, India would never join the price cap. But to give them incentive to ask for deeper discounts, this was the goal that can be that we can implement better by enforcing them, by encouraging them to go down that road and ask for a deeper discounts. And with the tighter enforcement, that is possible.
Thank you.
Henry.
Maria, if I can continue on this theme, not so much Russian oil exports, but sensitive UK exports. What more can be done to prevent the circumvention of those exports of sensitive equipment ending up in Russia via routes such as China, Turkey, and the Central Asian republics?
So the export controls is quite a powerful tool that has been brushed off from the Cold War era, right? We need to understand the lessons learned from that and how to improve them. First of all, export controls require time to unfold. They are not about denying technology necessarily, but by delaying the access to technology, meaning that this coalition needs to be as large as possible. Harmonization of export controls needs to be as tight as possible. And that is hard to do in a very globalized world where many countries now have a certain nexus, certain node in the supply chains of these critical items. Yet we can say that there has been a success in building these large coalitions, right? The Taiwan export controls have been tightened recently after investigation was issued in media. And that is one way to improve it, building larger international sanctions and export control coalitions. That comes sometimes with burden sharing, that not every country is incentivized to join, but finding good arguments and good narratives for these countries to join. Second is imposing higher penalties. Historically, violations in export controls enjoy much lower penalties than for sanctions, and that can be ramped up in the next steps. Third one, something that again is unfolding, is to leverage the role of financial institutions in export controls. Since 9/11, financial institutions have been key to sanctions and anti-money laundering. Now there is a development to engage them much closer in combating export control violations. That doesn't mean that by shifting the burden to financial institutions, they necessarily have all available information. So a whole of government approach is necessary, by which I mean interagency coordination with customs control, intelligence, and financial institutions, so they understand the whole supply chain and go beyond the KYC and understand what is happening in the third layer of supply chain, which is sometimes quite difficult, would be important to prevent any of the export control violations. The weakest point here is re-export of critical items via Western subsidiaries. This is where I think the Europeans are particularly weak, since their export controls is subject to member state level, and that enjoys some uneven enforcement and implementation. So extending consequences of export controls violation to subsidiaries in third countries would be one way to go. The recent development is that the EU implemented no Russia clause in the sanctions package. How much of that will be successfully implemented, I think, will also tell us how successful this measure will be.
And talking about collaboration with other countries, and also perhaps the reluctance of some to get involved in ending the circumvention of export sanctions because of the economic cost. What more do you think that like-minded allies can do to, as you put it, I think, burden share in terms of the both the cost of imposing sanctions, but also the effectiveness of them?
I think there are both sticks and carrots that can be employed in this strategy. In terms of carrots, I think in Asia there are important nodes of critical supply chains that, for example, countries in Southeast Asia are quite deeply involved in packaging or manufacturing of this. Drawing parallels to China sometimes helps to engage these countries. For example, having studied Japanese sanctions policy towards Russia, now there is a completely different understanding what needs to be done in terms of export controls. And South Korea and Taiwan had also joined a sanctioning coalition with the idea that the same sanctioning coalition can be gathered for the Chinese scenario. But there are also sticks. So as I mentioned, the role of financial institution in export controls can be elevated. And the recent executive order from the US does include the list of critical items which financial institutions will be obliged to monitor. If that by de facto creates extraterritorial export controls where financial institutions will have more responsibility in this area. And also secondary sanctions, right? This is the area that sometimes enjoys some controversial opinions, in particular from the European Union. But there are informal ways to unleash secondary sanctions effects. For example,
Maria, I'm just going to pause you there because I know Fabian wants to take you into secondary sanctions quite a lot. Henry, go on. Henry.
No, that's
fine. In which case, can I just ask you quickly, Professor Webb, before I move to Fabian? We spend a lot of our time in Parliament talking either about sanctions, sanctions evasion, secondary sanctions, or seizing and freezing. I will bring you on to seizing and freezing a lot more detail shortly. But is there an in-between ground? Are there other options that we're not exploring when you've looked at internationally the options available to us to essentially stop Russia's war of aggression?
So there's countermeasures more broadly. So it sounds like we'll be coming on to talking about seizing justified as a countermeasure, as a potential option. But countermeasures is a broad category. So countermeasures is a form of self-help in international law, where in order to induce compliance with an international obligation, so that's the corrective impulse that you mentioned earlier, in order to induce compliance, a state makes a temporary and reversible measure. And that can be asset freezes, that can be travel bans, that can be trade embargoes, it can be restrictions on overflight. So there can be a whole package of combinations presented as countermeasures that can help increase the pressure.
Thank you. Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. I'll come back to you, Maria, if I may, and ask you something you're about to answer, I think. What impact do you think the secondary sanctions imposed by the United States late last year, what impact are they actually having, if any?
I think this is an interesting development to go into the sanctions with the sanctions strategy. So far, the West has been, the US as well, has been rather tacit, timid with imposing secondary sanctions, but just the announcement of the executive order and the involvement of financial institutions much closer into aiding or facilitating Russia's military-industrial complex has already produced the results. Chinese, UAE, and Turkish banks have seized all connections to Russian banks, not necessarily sanctioned ones, because the standard of liability is much stricter. Traditionally, secondary sanctions are imposed when there is a knowledge standard, when a party had some sort of knowledge that this transaction would cause a violation. Here, the executive order specifies that wittingly and unwittingly, there will be consequences for foreign institutions to do so. And we're already seeing also spillover effects. The executive order excludes energy sector if it facilitates Russian military-industrial complex, yet now India and Turkey are both facing difficulties with procuring any payments from Russia for its energy. So this is the area to step up the pressure, since chasing evaders and facilitators is quite a tiring game, and Russia has more commitment and more capacities to invent. So the idea is to break down this dynamic where the West is always going after these evaders and to increase deterrence in the first place, and secondary sanctions is the way to go.
Thank you very much. Professor Webb, do you think there are important legal concerns about the use of secondary sanctions as distinct from other kinds of sanctions regimes, or are they the same?
There are distinct international law concerns, and they also depend on the type of secondary sanction. So we can break it down into at least 4 categories of secondary sanction. If you have a secondary sanction that imposes civil and criminal penalties on a state or entities related to a state for engaging in economic transactions with the sanctioned targets, for example, heavy fines, and that's extraterritorial, then it's quite a tenuous jurisdictional link. It might be based on a nationality link or a protective principle, both of which are not so strong in international law. And on the other hand, you'll be encroaching on the sovereignty of that third state to manage their external economic relations. However, if you have sanctions that limit a foreign person's access to the targeting state's economic and financial system, which is within their territorial sovereignty, then that is a secondary sanction, but it doesn't raise the same kind of sovereignty concerns because you're not penalising through fines, you are limiting their access to certain systems. The third category is where you have this conflict between international obligations. So you have international trade law, friendship and commerce treaties, international investment agreements, and they may be in direct conflict with what the secondary sanction is requiring a third state to do. And then finally, you have human rights issues, because if you have a foreign target of a secondary sanction, they're generally sanctioned before they've had a trial, before they've been convicted of a specific crime. So their due process rights have been circumvented through the imposition of that sanction.
Can I then ask, what do you think the risk to the United States and its partners like the United Kingdom are of an economic or political backlash from countries that are caught by secondary sanctions? I mean, is there any sign of this happening?
There's already been international litigation, not in the context of the Russian secondary sanctions, but in the context of secondary sanctions of the US against Iran. And so the risk is there. It ended up being a kind of midway point, and the International Court of Justice said that not all the measures complained of by Iran, which were the secondary sanctions, were capable of breaching the relevant treaty with the US. So we're kind of left with, as we often are with international law, a kind of open question that it could. There's been litigation about it, and there were various other findings. So I think the risk is there, but it's not a blanket prohibition.
Maria, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, sure. The impact of overuse and abusing secondary sanctions is heavily embedded in the discussion of de-dollarization, right? Because secondary sanctions are revolved around the use of the US dollar, access to the global financial system where the US dollar has primacy. And here, both Russia and China have done some homework. They have been creating alternative financial infrastructures and been pivoting away from the US foreign reserves. But I think what is important to understand that, again, if it is, the de-dollarization doesn't necessarily result in success if there is a broad international coalition. Russia has pivoted away from the US dollar, but it pivoted to the euro. Once the Europeans joined the asset seizure, and also the Japanese, who has probably twice as more as the UK in terms of the assets there, Russia had nowhere to go but to the Chinese currency. China doesn't have this option. So the more countries gathered around measures like this, the less leeway, the way out for these countries is much narrower. China cannot pivot to itself in terms of using yuan as this last resort foreign reserve currency. So this is one important lesson here. The second one, you can create alternatives to Visa and MasterCard, SPFS as the SWIFT alternative. Yet Russia cannot even convince toxic countries like Iran. It has only recently joined Russia's system because they don't see any added value. So creating them doesn't equate to successful de-dollarization.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dr. Shagina, can I ask, what would you regard as the view of, and how are other major economies, particularly India and China, responding to the way in which the West has deployed sanctions against Russia? And what, if any, would you say that the lessons that we in the UK should be taking from the experience of sanctioning Russia?
Well, first of all, having studied Russia-Chinese relations, China, since 2014, China doesn't help Russia in a benevolent way, right? In many cases, it's a country that leverages prices. For example, China is buying a lot of Russian coal, oil, and gas, but it charges different prices. It's charging much deeper discounts. Also, it doesn't come in a handy way in terms of bankrolling all of Russia's projects, infrastructure projects that the Kremlin needs. For example, Power of Siberia 2 is still hanging in limbo, and it's for China to decide the routes and the timing of this project. So these countries are capitalizing on Russia's isolation. It might look like they have formed a solid coalition bloc, but obviously for China and India, it is enjoying the position that they're currently in and sourcing commodities at much lower prices than usually would be. In terms of the lessons, I have 7 lessons, so if I can run them very quickly, if you allow me, or I'll shorten them. I think it's important to understand the target, and that requires right expertise both on Russia and China in terms of how to craft the first package, to understand the pain threshold of these targets. What are they willing to bear, which cost they're willing to incur for something that is high on their political agenda. Because often in the West, we're thinking about our costs for our economies, whereas for Russia and China, the costs to be paid are much higher, the pain threshold is much higher. Second is the limitation of sanctions in a militarized conflict. Sanctions only one tool in the toolbox. They can be compared with export controls and so on, but ultimately they will have limitations that they work over time. You need to ensure that they are robustly enforced. And against the military invasion either in Ukraine or in Taiwan, it has to be paired with military support and also some sort of positive economic statecraft as supporting Ukraine or Taiwan financially. The third one is, again, building these international coalitions, which will be important for any conflict ahead of us, because it allows the West to make sure that there are less loopholes in those existing sanctions and export controls regimes. G7 has become this platform to do so, and I think this is the way to go forward. Moscow and Beijing doesn't enjoy partners of the similar kind. It can't build large sanctioning coalition. Strategic communication with the global South has been something that has been missing in Western strategy, something that can be stepped up going further. And then target's response, right? Quite often it's forgotten how target can respond to those measures. It's viewed sort of one-dimensionally. We impose sanctions and they will work. Well, the targets don't sit idly by, they react and adapt to it. So anticipating response in this multi-layered game is also important to make sure we have enough levers, enough measures to implement. And finally, enforcement capacity building, not just at home, but also in partner states is important. Domestic resilience is really where it starts. The economic statecraft, it starts at home. The more robust we are at home, the freer we are to impose some painful sanctions. Germany and Russian gas is a story here to have in mind. And cooperation with the private sector, I think, is key. They are really at the forefront of implementing these measures, so making sure they are on board or even part of designing some of the measures, like it was with the price cap, is, I think, one lesson to draw here.
And just a very, very quick follow-up. So, in your opinion, how we have applied sanctions, will that be seen as an effective deterrent for those thinking about aggression or thinking about violating international humanitarian law? Have we, by our actions, deterred?
Well, we have clearly failed at deterrence. That's not a big surprise here, but I think pondering the question why we failed and could we reverse this development is, I think, an exercise worth undertaking. I believe that we started high as the campaign of sanctions was announced. Whether we remained high with measures is a big question mark. By delaying oil embargo and the price cap until December 2022 has really allowed Russia to recoup and partially rebuild its fortress strategy. And this is the lesson for any future sanctions regime. The timing and sequencing of sanctions is really important. Incremental approach has its validity, can exist obviously in the current sanctions regime, yet it allows the targets to adapt. It gives them valuable time to find third parties or to reorient supply chains and so on. And in this case, as I said, unfortunately, the targets win this cat and mouse game because they have more commitment and are willing to redirect more capacities towards this circumvention.
Thank you.
Professor Webb, you've talked about how the fact that you think that seizing it is a valid legal countermeasure in law. You've also set out why there's such opposition, which is that it's seen as a fundamental in terms of sovereign immunity. But why has it taken, given that we are now getting to a place where most people agree that we can seize assets, why has it taken so long, and why is the European Central Bank particularly so reluctant, when to my view this goes to, if we've had a failure of deterrence, which I think most of us would agree in this room has taken place, this is possibly one of the only things left in our toolbox that could act as a deterrent to other states who may be considering such action in the future?
So I think there isn't an exact precedent, and I think that makes states cautious. I think also the potential for the impact on the global economy and the potential for, in the future, other states treating this as some kind of precedent is what has led to hesitation. Having said that, I do see a difference from a few months ago. I see a momentum building within the G7. I think the EU passing laws to take the windfall tax, which will be 3 billion euros a year consistently, that is a first step, and that's showing part of this shift. And I think it's interesting. I agree entirely with Maria's 7 points, and I think they're also applicable to making the confiscation of central bank assets effective. And I would just add an 8th point to them, which is to make it really narrowly tailored. And that would deal with the problem of, this is setting a precedent. One day this could be used against us in the UK. And the way you make it, there's multiple ways to make it narrowly tailored, but there are 3 ways that I can give now. So you could limit it, and this means either transferring the assets outright to a fund or to Ukraine in some way, or there's been talk about using the assets as collateral and then using syndicated bonds. The end result is that you're transferring money to Ukraine. You can say this is limited to Russia and Ukraine. This is a very conflict-specific action. The second option is you say this is limited to situations where a principal organ of the UN has determined that an act of aggression has taken place. And that leaves the door open to possible other action, but at such a high bar. And we have that in this case because in November 2022, the General Assembly passed a resolution saying that Russia was liable for full reparation to Ukraine, and previously in March it had determined that there was an act of aggression. The third option is that you say this applies where there's credible evidence of international crimes. That's a broader option, but it still has a very high bar to be met.
That's incredibly interesting. And can I just push you, particularly that second one? Can I push you on? You touched on the fact that you'd written a paper about why these assets should be used for reconstruction of Ukraine. Do you draw a distinction in international law between using these assets to pay for the defence of Ukraine and paying for the reconstruction? And if so, why? Because I think politically, for me personally, there should be no distinction, but I'm not a lawyer.
Yes. So I do draw a distinction because the route through that I'm speaking about is countermeasures, where we are inducing compliance with an international obligation. Here, the use of the assets is tied to the reconstruction of Ukraine, the $480 billion and growing that is needed. That is inducing compliance with Russia's obligation to pay full reparation in international law. It is not inducing compliance with Russia's obligation to stop its aggression.
That's so interesting. Ranil?
Well, thank you. I think the professor has in some ways dealt with those, in passing, the legal arguments that could be employed to by us that could leave us vulnerable to abuse by other states. But you've tightened up by providing some ideas on how we could do that. I mean, ultimately, in terms of the UN test, there have been cases where the UN has gone against what we might have wanted in this country. So it's not quite such a high bar, really, is it?
But it's not just that the UN passes a resolution. It is that the UN passes a resolution determining an act of aggression. I mean, this is the highest violation of the UN Charter.
Could the precedent not be set? I'm not a lawyer either, but couldn't the precedent be set that then if the UN is the body that is responsible in this context, then though on this occasion it was an act of aggression, in a future dispute it could be something else, so long as the UN is seen to be, and given this grand status, that it is the arbiter?
So I don't think it's necessary for this plan to work, and I can see the downsides of it. In my view, I think you can limit it to an act of aggression determined by a majority of a UN principal organ. That could be the Security Council, but you have the veto issue, or it could be the General Assembly, or credible evidence of the most serious international crimes. But I don't think I would leave it broadly open for any kind of potential resolutions topic.
No, indeed, that's my fear. Thank you.
I would love to keep you more. That was fascinating, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to move to our final panel. I'm not going to suspend the session, so can I both say thank you to both of you? That was really illuminating, and we're going to bring in the next witnesses, but we'll remain live while we do that. As I mentioned, we've remained live, so we will move on. There we go. Minister, thank you ever so much for finding the time. We know this was at short notice. We really do appreciate it. Today we've heard evidence about the forced transfer of Ukrainian children, and then we've been looking at sanctions against Russia and also the arguments around seizing and freezing and seizing Russian state assets. You recently published the brand new UK sanctions strategy. Now, there have been criticisms of it in the traditional sense of the word. It's not really a strategy so much as a general approach, because it's descriptive rather than setting out a plan of action of how to make UK sanctions policy more effective. How do you believe that this policy is going to make a meaningful difference to our approach to sanctions?
Thank you, and thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to come and talk a bit more about this area of work. It's something that, as you're aware, Chair, has grown substantially, sadly, necessarily so, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it, as it were, enabled us to really think about how, with the extra resource that we were able to get from the Treasury, we wanted to really harness what had already begun to be an excellent set of regimes and really think coherently about how we present it. You know, we know that sanctions are a really vital tool in the mix, in helping us to pursue and make clear our perspectives, our interests, protecting those values, particularly obviously around the human rights sanctions, where we always demonstrated very clearly how we use those tools. But we really wanted to be able to bring together a coherent picture on what the UK sanctions tools are for and how we might use them. So I think that was very much the message, and almost a chance to sort of anchor into the system. Let's remind ourselves what sanctions are about, why they're so important, why they're not the only tool in the box, of course, but to be conscious that we wanted to set out that we want to continue to use our sanctions and new sanctions regimes if we need them. We have that flexibility to be able to maximise the impact in a crisis situation, and to continue to build so that we can think about how we can always get ahead of loopholes. We know that it's a bit of a whack-a-mole game, sanctions always. No one would suggest it's not. So to really set out and restate how we do that. Of course, we also saw with the fund that we got from the Economic Deterrence Initiative, money from last year's funding settlement, 50 million to help us bring in more on the enforcement side, and we've been growing those teams, both the Ioffe team and the Treasury, and now the OTC team, the trade side, so that it's all very well, the Foreign Office make the legislation, we set out the view, most people follow it, and that's good, but those that might not, enforcement is required. So we've been able to invest really heavily. That's not so much, though my team in the Foreign Office has grown dramatically, but more widely those enforcing parts of government also invested in. So we've been able to set out, I hope, in the strategy, a clear picture of all the tools that we now have, where we're investing, and how, in a very flexible way. So I think in that sense it's not a very specific strategy, it's a broad brush strategy, because this is a set of tools that will grow as needed.
Thank you. I know Ren will take you into some of that, more of that, but I think you're absolutely right in terms of it does set out a general approach, but it doesn't set any outcomes, it doesn't set out any metrics by which you're going to assess the team. So how are you, as the Minister, going to determine that David and his Directorate are delivering success, that they're actually delivering, hold them to account?
So I think that's a really fair question, and I'm not sure that it's only me as the Sanctions Minister will hold them to account. I think Parliament and the UK's voice as well.
Parliament definitely will,
exactly.
But I know ministers like to hold their officials to account.
Well, I think that's right, but actually, really importantly, this is not like you need to build 7 hospitals before next Friday strategy or policy document. This is setting out the tools we have and being able to draw in that effectiveness. So I think the enforcement side will be one area, clearly, where monitoring that, assessing whether that's really on top of its game, indeed whether they've got the resources to do it. I think, the Treasury would say that historically there wasn't necessarily enough resource to be able to really keep ahead of that, and now we've changed that and we've seen a big investment in the team and much more capability to work with those tools. So I think it will be continuing that. The challenge for the team, and our challenge, is can the team turn out and keep on top of new sanctions when they're required, the pace at which we might need to go. So really, it's an interesting conversation I often have with people. How does it work? What does it do? Why can't you just sanction them because they're bad people? We need clear open source evidence that we can put in front of a judge that we think will withstand judicial review, because the company sanctioned clearly probably won't be pleased with that impact. So, and we've been, I'm hugely proud of the team, because actually we've had over the last few months a number of cases taken to the legal system to be tested, and we have won all our battles to date. And I think that's a really strong reflection for me that if you like, the strategy is working. The work that they are doing, the legislative work that they're doing, is holding up under pressure, and that's where success is we can continue to follow that very robust line and really, to my whack-a-mole point, keep chasing down every time we see an opportunity, if we can get that evidence. And I'm very confident that the team are really good now at knowing exactly what package they need to have in the file in order to put themselves in front of a judge if necessary.
And so in terms of where you think there are points of improvement, so if you were to be setting out a strategy as to how we get to effective outcomes, is it that we need to move faster in terms of identifying the speed at which we move? Is it that we're not good enough yet at sharing intelligence with our partners? Is that we're not good enough at integrating advice from, for example, the US, who've gone a lot further than us on sanctions? I remember your colleague telling us the reason the US had sanctioned more people than us was they were bigger a country. I was to hope that our sanctions policy has improved since that point, that we would have meaningful reasons. Where do you see there being delays or issues within the way we approach sanctions at the moment that you hope the policy will resolve?
Well, I think we are doing it right. To the US point, that's partly they have a very, very much larger team. Mm-hmm. So we have more than doubled the size of our team with an amazing cohort of now experts, and the team happy to speak to that in more detail if you'd like. But I'm sure if we doubled the size of the team again, if the Treasury would give us the money, we would chase down, more bad people more quickly. The reality about sanctions is you've always got to get that balance about impact. So, we can sanction 1 million people. Would it make the difference? Actually, picking off where we can really make a difference and we can have that impact is as important as a volume business of sanctions, if you like. So I think we've got a size and expertise of team now who are able to get ahead of chasing down those who we think need that sanction put upon them, but also continuing to work. And we always say this, and I think all of us as ministers, when we stand at the dispatch box, and you will, or colleagues will ask the question, why haven't sanctions? So, and the answer is always, I'm afraid we don't talk about future sanctions, precisely because it's a tool that's useful with the element of surprise. It works if you know it's coming, you'll move your assets so that there's no power to our sanction. So I think that's really important. But working with colleagues, with investigative journalists, with NGOs, gathering information, we are never going to have a team, that can spread across the world harnessing information. So we want the most effective ways that we can work with those who might share with us what we can then decide whether it's strong enough evidence. That's always going to be something where we can grow, I think, and that's an important part of the whole. I always think it's quite difficult. It's like a bucket. Give me everything you have, put it in my bucket, and then the team will have a look. I can't tell you if it's any good, but if it is, you might see it pop up later. And I think that's quite a difficult conversation to have with people, and I have it in a number of countries when I'm, visiting across the Indo-Pacific, where people will say, on a human rights issue, and I'll say, well, please share with our teams the evidence that you have, and we will take that away. I just can't tell you until such time as a sanction appears whether or not it was what we needed.
And I would say I've been pleased to see the responsiveness of the department to the sanctions that we've requested as a committee, and we have seen, particularly following our Wagner strategy, gradually those people being sanctioned. But Ranul.
Thank you. Minister, we both served at the Department for International Trade, as it was then, and alongside trade, having trade sanctions, quite understandably, at the current time, financial sanctions, transport sanctions, immigration sanctions, all held in respective departments. Yeah. You're now a sort of poacher turned gamekeeper as an FCDO minister. Given that the Foreign Office sets the direction now for overall sanctions policy, yes. What's your view in your current role? But perhaps if you wish to share your view from your past role, how do you make sure that it's effectively implemented and enforced across these different departments?
So, absolutely right. I think we worked together on this when the war kicked off. That was that first tranche of trade sanctions. We were sort of the first out of the blocks with really assessing where the obvious barriers that we could put up were. And bringing in, trade zero, trades 1 and 2, kind of growing number of areas of trade that we wanted to cut off to reduce Russia's ability both to execute its war, to be able to raise funds and so on. But I think if you look, and you'll see it in the strategy on page 25, we've sort of set out where the kind of roles and responsibilities across government lies. So the FCDO holds the legislative pen, and I guess the kind of cross-Whitehall conductor's pen, but actually delivering and asking for. So, if you, Trade Minister, can see another area that, you've got a business that, business stream that you think we really ought to be cutting off, bring it to us and we will legislate. But actually the point of OFTI, the new trading arm, which DBT will own of enforcement, is now effectively the flip side of that. We didn't have that 2 years ago, which was we can draw a swathe of business areas that we want to cut off so that Russia's economy is reduced, but we didn't then have an enforcement power. We now have that, which will be hugely impactful, and I think that is helping other departments to think about where they can see potential areas to continue to reduce Russia's capabilities, for instance.
Is this the best way of making sure that sanctions policy is properly implemented across all these departments? Or would it make more sense in time, perhaps, to give a bit more thought to a single sanctions unit that could sit potentially in the Foreign Office with staff brought in from relevant departments so that everyone is working very tightly together and there's no, perhaps, misunderstanding or, at the other end of the spectrum, conflict between departments as to what the objective should be?
I think that's a fair challenge. I would say, now that we have good enforcement teams both in the Treasury and in DBT, they are the ones with the relationships with the financial institutions in the Treasury's case, where of course a big chunk of those sanctions sit, or indeed the relationships with businesses, the export networks, the civil servants, in large numbers who are connected day by day to all our businesses, and I think it's more effective and immediate for them to be able to have effectively another layer to their relationship. I'm very sorry, just so you be aware, you can't trade with Russia on X, Y, or Z. That's a relationship that exists. For it to be somewhere completely separate, I think would make it probably more difficult for those who are left with having to enact sanctions. So I've spent time with a number of kind of lawyers in the city who are charged with having to help companies navigate our sanction system. And they are all people who are either experts in trade or they are banking lawyers. So they live in the specialty that is where the sanction sits. So I think I'm quite comfortable that the model we've got, whilst we do the legislation as a the policy arm of the whole strategy, those who have the relationship with those who are having to deal with the sanction and make sure that they don't breach it by mistake are linked into the department where they've got that really strong relationship already.
And just so I'm really clear, thank you for that answer, and that's very helpful, and it's good to understand that thinking around this potential problem that could arise in the future around disconnect. Can I just be clear, is that your thought today as to the benefits or disbenefits of a united system, or is that something that's been considered more fully in the department and across government in the past that you're relaying to us now?
So as we've grown over the last years with the Russia sanctions regime adding a vast, extra workload and volume of sanctions activity, we've always held the legislative position, and obviously, as it were, has existed within the Treasury. The view has been that as we've developed this and the volume has grown, we continue to believe that it's better to have the enforcement half of the...
Have you actually considered uniting it, or have you simply said all the way through we're content with the current system? Has there ever been that consideration?
No, I haven't had those conversations. I looked at David in terms of, we've always developed this from which is the best bit of government to do this at pace and effectively.
To know whether it's the best bit. Because
that's a fair question.
You have to then consider and disregard an alternative. So I just want to be clear that has that happened or not?
We've kept it under review, and one of the things we tried to do in the strategy is set out where we come to in terms of the cross-government architecture. I think the argument for it being led out of the Foreign Office is that fundamentally sanctions are a tool of foreign policy, but they only work if you have good cross-Whitehall collaboration. So it's absolutely vital that you have clear roles and responsibilities, and to your point on how we could strengthen, I think, investment in building capability across government. I think the other area, Minister, if I could elaborate, where I think we might be able to do more is on the legislative tools. So as we've gone through this, we've built on the legislation and we've expanded our the options and tools at our disposal. And one area where I think we could go much further is on vessel specification, for example, which would give us more power to disrupt those who are trying to circumvent the oil price cap.
Can I just quickly clarify before I go to Fabian though, so beyond the kind of key sanctions unit, you also still have a sanctions lead in the Syria team, a sanctions lead in the Iraq team, a sanctions lead in the Iran team, so actually we have an incredibly dispersed number of people working on sanctions in addition to you having your directorate or team.
We have a different model. So for Russia, we work very closely with Ben's Directorate, but sanctions on Russia are led out of the Sanctions Directorate. The whole of the sanctions life cycle, from targeting, strategy, implementation, defensive litigation. For other regimes, for example, Syria or Myanmar, it's the targeting and strategy is a joint piece of work with the Geographic Directorate and the Sanctions Directorate. I think the Russia model sort of works well at the moment because it's such an intense amount of work that having it all centralised in one place works. With the other directorates, I think it depends on good working relationships. For the most part, I think it works well. But we have those two different models depending on the type of regime.
But do you see why I would have concerns about it? Seems odd to me to have a central sanctions team who are expert at it and know what they're doing and they know how to do this and make it work, but we're relying on people who might have been, I don't know, in charge of human rights in Mongolia the year before to suddenly become experts on sanctions in Syria from zero. Wouldn't it make much more sense for it all to be run through one sanctions team rather than having it all dispersed and actually therefore have inherent weaknesses because somebody in the first 3 months of their job could not be as good as someone who's done sanctions for 4 years?
If you have it dispersed, you need sanctions experts in the Geographic Directorate. So one of the things that
But forgive me, they're not experts though, that's my point. They come from whatever posting they've previously done and then they suddenly have to become an expert in sanctions and they sit alone in their team with no one else who's an expert in sanctions.
They need to be trained and they need to get access to specialist support, and that's one of the things we've been doing is building a sanctions curriculum, not just for the Foreign Office but also for Whitehall departments. So it's one of the things we've been doing through the Economic Deterrence Initiative is to build those skills, not just for Russia, but so that we have a standing capability that we can use.
All right, Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, are you able to share with us the total estimated value of UK assets belonging to sanctioned Russians compared to the value of those assets actually traced and frozen? Do you have that information?
So Ofsey, who published a review, I think it was in October, was the last one, kind of have the list. Of the latest figure is about 22 million, 27 billion.
So the latest...
I'll get my numbers right around.
Private assets or Russian sovereign assets, private assets. Just over 23 billion.
22.
Yeah.
But there isn't a sort of definitive list in the sense that no one is asked when they're sanctioned to hand in a balance sheet. So we may know they can share, but there isn't a requirement for a full listing to be submitted upon sanction.
So out of 1,702 Russians whose UK assets have been theoretically frozen, how many does the government know to have any assets in the UK?
So that's a good question to which I don't have a ability to answer, but let me come back to you. That would be an on-off-sea detail, but we'll try and get that answer and write to you on that one.
Thank you. Can I then ask why the UK has only issued 2 fines for non-compliance with asset freezes?
So again, Ofsey, who are the managers of this side of things, have done that there. So that's a last year's figure, if I recall. But of course, their growth in their team now is allowing them to be much more sort of forward-leaning. I don't know if that's the right terminology. Ability to keep up with that, and so they look at many cases. Some are then discarded as not needing fining. Others have moved to review, and then some have been fined. But I think I would expect us to see, but it would be a question you would need to ask the Ofsey team to be specific, or I'm happy to get them to write to you, just how much their increased capacity in their team is likely to enable them to get ahead of some of those more quickly.
You would expect the growth in the team to yield
Yes,
further fines, prosecutions and fines.
Absolutely. So that was one of the challenges in the Economic Deterrence Initiative funding package, which we asked for, which was funded in full by the Prime Minister, was in really, we were very conscious that partly because obviously the Russia sanctions scheme had given us an exponentially larger workload for my team, but also the other side of that was going to be a much greater workload in keeping track of and sanctioning, so and enforcing on those sanctions. So that's a large proportion of that has been to grow the enforcement teams across Whitehall to ensure that we can get ahead of that.
May just a small supplementary, Chair.
Of course.
Have you any evidence or any idea or any anecdotal evidence of the effect that freezing those assets is actually having on the determination of the owners of those assets to continue supporting the war against Ukraine and in Ukraine? In other words, is it effective at all, or is it just a nuisance for them? They've got plenty of other assets.
So I couldn't touch on the detail, but I think if you look at some of the reviews that have happened where sanctioned individuals in particular have felt aggrieved and felt they wanted to challenge the sanction and the sanction premise, where we are having to demonstrate that they have, got, connections with, demonstrating support for the Putin regime and, supporting Russia. The cases have been a very, very strong case that say, no, you said I was involved with this company. No, I'm not anymore, and I sold my shares a long time ago. So there's been, absolutely, I think it's effective and impactful, because those who really feel that we've, chastised them wrongly have worked really hard to try and disprove the evidence that we've presented to the judge. So I think it's incredibly impactful, and for those that perhaps are feeling that they are not in any way supporting Putin, they are really going out of their way to try and justify that case. So I would say, I can't talk about specific ones obviously, but I've seen plenty of efforts to say, you've misunderstood, I really am not a supporter of Putin. I have not been involved with these companies for a number of years. So we are seeing that. But there are many who aren't challenging it because it's quite clear that they would just fall flat on their faces in court, because the case that we've brought under sanction is very robust.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, if we are really serious about freezing assets and sanctioning Russian oligarchs, why do we allow them to draw down an allowance worth tens of thousands of pounds a month? And can you understand that people in the UK might find that pretty strange, but people in Ukraine will find it absolutely outrageous? And whose decision was that? Is that an FCDO decision, or is that a Treasury decision?
I'm not the expert on the detail. David, do you want to set out how that works? It's a Treasury.
So on licensing, it's a decision by the Office for Financial Sanctions Implementation that they'll consult the FCDO on particular cases. Generally, the Office policy is to limit expenses to the UK median wage and to not allow designated persons funding, for example, private education or private healthcare. They're expected to use state education, state healthcare. So that's their broad policy. They will consult us on particular cases.
So I'm wrong when I say that people can draw down tens of thousands of pounds a month. That doesn't happen at all anywhere.
I can talk to the broad policy. I can't give you that confirmation in every case. They are allowed to get substantial sums to pay for their legal costs, for example, which I think is right. They have an ability to bring claims against the UK government, and we have an ability to defend them, and as the Minister said, to win those. I would have to go back to Office for more detailed assurances on the overall costs that they fund.
So there's no Russian oligarchs drawing down money to finance what would be regarded as a lavish lifestyle.
They wouldn't get a licence for that. So the numbers could be around legal fees. We're happy to ask Office to give you more information if that would be useful. But the policy is fairly narrow.
Okay, and robust.
Yes, but again, they come back to the licensing and enforcement piece, which now they have much more resource to do.
If I may, so we know that Prigozhin obviously was allowed to access legal funds, as you say, that may be right. But according to the detail I have, so Mikhail Friedman had a licence to receive an allowance of £760,000 a year. Peter Arvin was told by Office that he could have £60,000 a month for basic needs. Now, whilst people may believe that politicians live lavish lifestyles, £60,000 a month seems to be quite an egregious figure. And whilst we're saying that the policy sits with Office, I would say that ministers would have the right to overrule to ask permission to see every single allowance that is signed off and to say yes or no to that? Am I wrong that we would have the ability to overrule that?
The Minister always has the opportunity to do that, but that would be a Treasury Minister who would do that.
And have you had discussions with Treasury Ministers about how much they're allowing these
Not
to
in
take place
detail,
in
not
compliance?
personally, no, but I think that's a conversation that you certainly, write to the Treasury or invite them to come and
I think we can
give
take
that
this as a
discussion.
request from the committee for you to speak to your Treasury counterpart and then write back to us jointly on what we're going to
Happy
do
to do
around
that.
this.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Brendan, apologies.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, you'll have heard again this morning at FCDO questions, and this committee has been calling for it for some time, about the money from the Chelsea Fund to go to Ukraine. Can you tell us what is causing the delays? Where are those blocks, and how quickly do you expect them to be resolved?
So I'm not able to talk about the detail, but there is some real progress now, which is, I think, good. I think it's been frustrating for all involved, but there is real progress. I'm afraid I can't talk about it in more detail at the moment, but I'm much more optimistic than if you'd asked me 3 months ago that we are going to see a position from which progress can be made.
Thank you. Finally, for me, this new voluntary process which is being developed, whereby individuals can give their sanctioned assets to Ukraine. How do you envisage that is going to work, and who will have responsibility for that policy?
So we brought it through in the SI last year, and it was indeed on the back of the Chelsea way of looking at this challenge, and brought it through. It hasn't been tested yet. I know, David, do you want to talk to its next stages, I guess? Implementation stages.
So in practice, it would work that a designated person would apply for a licence from the Office for Financial Sanctions Implementation to make a donation voluntarily to support the reconstruction of Ukraine. It wouldn't be a quid pro quo for sanctions lifting, and we've been very clear throughout that that's the case.
And do you the feedback you've got, do you expect people to volunteer to do that? As you say, there's no quid pro quo. So what would make a Russian oligarch voluntarily hand over his or her assets?
Sense of belief in helping rebuild Ukraine.
Okay, but I just wonder, is that...
You ask them, I don't know. We have made it possible because
okay.
It's a route that we want to be able to help people to do.
I suppose, are you responding to a demand?
A demand from those who say this should be possible. There is now a legal route to do so. I'm all for helping people to do the right thing. So we have now a framework which allows them to do the right thing. If they wish to do so, they will do so out of the goodness of their hearts, because they realise that helping Ukraine to be rebuilt is a good thing.
And oligarchs are renowned for just that.
I'm looking forward to seeing the first one appear.
Yes, indeed. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Royston.
Is allowing people to make these voluntary contributions just letting them off the hook what they've done in the past in order to amass these great sums of wealth?
Doesn't let them off the hook. We won't take off any sanction that might be on them and their assets. So there's no personal benefit. It is literally, it's an opportunity for some altruistic behaviour from those who might wish to demonstrate support for Ukraine. I haven't seen a long queue yet, to be honest, Royston, but
I was just wondering
we are here to encourage those to give generously to help rebuild Ukraine.
Perhaps there'll be a rush.
Perhaps. I'll keep you posted.
Can we talk about frozen Russian assets? What progress do you expect there to be at the G7 later this year on frozen Russian assets being used as reparations in Ukraine?
So I think there is honestly really good progress now, and it's been really difficult. Obviously, we all have different legal systems. That challenge of clearly not wanting to breach international law, but the questions around sovereignty and ownership, the fear of historic reparations challenges. It came as we started to have these conversations last year. It came with a whole series of really difficult legal questions, and I think we've made really good progress as a cohort. Our Attorney General, others really working together to find to really test the pathways going forward. So I think we are, I'm hopeful that we will see progress at the next G7 gathering together. I think it's, this is enormously difficult to get through. So we've, I think we're starting to get a clearer picture domestically of what we might, be comfortable with, if that's the right way to put it. But we know that it's impactful if we do it. It's most impactful if we do it as a group, and we set the, if you like, the global perspective on what we consider to be as effective as possible. There are, somewhere around, we think, $400 billion worth of frozen assets across the piece. That's not a precise number, but substantial funds. But we have got to make sure that at the point when we get to that end point where agreement is reached, we can do something which will hold the test of time and be robust. So that's really important, that we can work with a framework that is assured across many, as I say, different legal jurisdictions, because they're not all the same, and that's a really important part of this.
I suppose legal concerns are obvious across jurisdictions, but are there any delays being caused by political or economic concerns? Is there any, is everyone on the same page?
I think absolutely everybody wants to find a way to make this possible. That, I don't think that's in question. The challenge is coming at it from different legal environments and different perspectives on how we land the outcome as effectively as possible. I think there's an absolute complete agreement in mindset across the G7, where we want to find a solution to this which can enable those frozen assets to become seized assets, used assets for the purposes of reconstructing Ukraine. So that, I don't think there's not a paper between us all on wanting to do that. Finding the way through that is going to be robust and hold up legally is the challenge that they've all been battling with.
There's no countries that are more or less enthusiastic. I mean, because these things just drag on all the time, and sometimes it can be, I don't think they're more or less enthusiastic. I think it's that different legal systems, different relationships, different historic experiences mean that everyone's come to the table having to work through their own perspectives. But everybody is determined to find a way through that means that we can take those frozen assets and use them for the rebuilding of Ukraine.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks, Chair. The IMF expects the Russian economy to grow by 2.6%. And I just wonder if there's more you want to say about improving the efficacy of sanctions and tackling evasion. And perhaps we could talk about some ideas. Perhaps you could start with the re-export of dual-use UK goods to Russia.
So, as I said at the beginning, I think one of the great challenges, whilst sanctions are an incredibly powerful tool, and we were very focused, as were many other countries, right at the start, we had to do all we could to reduce Putin's ability to fund his war, both through cash, through the tools of trade to continue, the economy being stronger, but also through reducing all those other elements that help fund a war, build the war machine, sustain the war machine. So we've had a enormous wave of different sanctions, from trade to transport to the oil price cap.
The UK economy has gone into recession, but Russia is predicted to grow. So focusing in on evasion or improving sanctions, are there sectors you want to talk about? Sky News ran a report today about UK motor sector, for example, luxury vehicles, over £100,000 still reaching Russia. Is the government intending to act on that sector?
So there are already very clear in our trade sanctions, going back to those early trade sanctions, those sorts of sales of vehicles, sales of anything that could be dual use, and also those goods that could be priority goods to support Putin's war. Those have been sanctioned and sales banned.
Yet they're still reaching.
So directly to Russia, since very early on in the proceedings. The challenge is around a company selling, in this case, cars to a third country who isn't sanctioned. So we have, for instance, a lot of sanctions for Belarus, replicated from Russia. We know that they are acting very much as a client state for Russia. But for other countries, third countries, we would expect our businesses and the trade guidance which we set out right early on, which what was then the Department of International Trade set out guidance to help companies navigate this enormous sudden wave of sanctions, sets out very clearly that they shouldn't be doing business obviously with Russia or potentially with a third country that might support Russia. So as these things appear, as indeed the Sky report by Ed Conway has come out today, exactly that, it appears that there is, and I haven't followed through the data yet, I haven't had a chance, but if it appears that there is a diversionary activity to sell goods that have a potential both dual use and value, then there is a need for those businesses to consider their position, and for DBT and now the Office of Trade team to have conversations with them to see whether they are legitimately didn't think anything of it, or whether there is something which needs dealing with. And I think this is the challenge of whack-a-mole and new ways. We have very, very strong relationships with those Central Asian countries, and they have been incredibly forward-leaning to the sanctions that we have. So I think the challenge here is where countries appear to be being used as an intermediary, which appears to be the case, those conversations will continue to help get to the bottom of
the motor example came out today, but yes. one that came out a little while ago, I think, through the Financial Times, is the UK is now a growth sector, the largest underwriter of Russian oil exported by ship. About a third of it is now underwritten by UK firms. Is there going to be action on this? And this was reported a few weeks ago, so is work already underway with the insurance sector, for example?
So we've worked very closely with them right from the start across so the Department of Transport obviously manages the shipping pillar of our sanctions, and they're asking we do the policy side, and that's been a continual area of additional work. I don't know if David, you want to pick up on this particular latest one?
I think it goes to the dual purposes of the oil price cap. So it was designed to do two things. One was to limit revenues for Russia, and the second was to avoid a spike in the price of oil, which would impact on the global south, but also potentially generate more revenue for Russia. So we deliberately decided that the G7 could continue to provide financial services to Russian ships, provided the oil was sold below $60. That's had a significant impact. Russian revenues from oil down about 30% last year, but we need to make sure that this price cap is not being circumvented, that any of those financial services that are being supplied are not being supplied where oil is sold above the cap. And there are a couple of things you can do there. One is tighten domestic enforcement. The other is to target the networks in third countries that are being used for circumvention, and recent sanctions packages have done that. I think the US and UK actions in February particularly have had a big disruptive effects. There's definitely things you can do to ensure that where financial services are coming from the G7, which is partly the design of the policy, the oil is definitely being sold below $60 and it's having an impact on Russian revenues.
And then there's this distinction between crude and refined, because there's a clear policy on crude, but the BBC have reported about the UK now inadvertently funding the Kremlin to the tune of about £140 million through the import of refined oil. And I just wonder, Minister, you said you wanted some flexibility in the system, but is this where the system is too flexible and action needs to be taken?
So no, I think there's those sorts of challenges in refined where you are seeing potentially crude oil being shipped to a third country and refined and then imported. These continue to be areas where we look to tighten and understand better and try and find ways to be able to identify effectively. So it's a really interesting example, some of the work that was done around grain, when the grain initiatives were being tackled right early on after Russia invaded, to be able to identify sources using clever chemistry. There are challenges around oil and gas identifiability and being able to track those flows of oil. I think what you highlight, one of the challenges which worries me particularly, is the shadow and dark fleets of oil moving now around Russia and across other parts of the globe, not only because they might be breaching the oil price cap and other countries are willing to pay different price, but because they are using very old shipping and the risks to environment and indeed to communities who would then have no recourse because they're not insured in an appropriate way is very high. And that's a whole other area that we are all working together to think about. So there's a huge amount of work going on to try and think about how we can be impactful in both reducing the ability for them to ship their oil that way and get and breach the oil price cap, but also to try and reduce the environmental risks.
Thank you, Neil. I'm just going to try and bring in two more. Brendan.
Yes, thank you, Chair. In our first session, we heard that sanctions on Russian individuals and institutions can deter and impact their policy of sort of forced transfer or kidnap of Ukrainian children. And I wonder what work is being done to expand what the FCDO can do and what levers it might have at its disposal to prevent this appalling use of child kidnapping in Russia.
So I think from a sanctions perspective, again, as I said at the beginning, we need to be able to have open source evidence to help us to sanction individuals or organisations who would be doing those heinous acts, for instance. So there would be a challenge there to that evidence gathering base. I don't know, Ben, if it's the space that you sadly have to look at.
Sure. I mean, this is an appalling array of crimes, and obviously we'll use such tools as we've got. I mean, look, one of the very first things that is important is to do exactly what we're doing now, which is to talk about it, expose it, and show it up for what's going on. The second, frankly, is to work with exactly the sort of organisations who met you earlier today, and I was pleased to work with Save Ukraine to expose their work to a slightly larger audience a few months ago. We're also in an international coalition that the Canadians have helped launch to try to get together a range of countries to meet to discuss, what can be done more in this area. There are a number of countries who are seeking to mediate or to broker deals. The Qataris have had some success. The Vatican has had some success. And then, of course, there's the International Criminal Court, which has issued its arrest warrants against Maria Lvova-Belova, the Russian Children's Commissioner, for exactly this, as well as sanctions. These are all, incremental things that we can do. If there are other ideas out there, I'm sure we would be delighted to hear them. This is a really appalling crime that is trying to remove the Ukrainian identity of a wide range of people, and it's causing immense trauma and pain to Ukrainian families.
Russia doesn't act alone in this, and we heard evidence this afternoon that Belarus is complicit in accepting kidnapped Russian children for re-education. Have you sanctioned any Belarusian officials in relation to this forced transfer or kidnapping of Ukraine children?
I don't think on this,
I'm
but
not sure
the Belarusians have a continuing wave of, so precisely for that reason we do see them acting very much in concert with Putin. So there is a whole Belarusian sanctions regime which is sadly very active as well. But I think to the point we would look and welcome all evidence that could help us identify individuals who we would absolutely want to sanction and be able to demonstrate, the horror that is this activity going on, as we have done through some of our human rights sanctioning tools in other parts of the world.
Thank you.
I think the point I would make about that is that, Minister, you said we need information and we talk about it, expose it. With the ICC, we have evidence. There is significant evidence. So I'm surprised that given the ICC has said that there is essentially this taking place, we recognise it as an act of genocide. It seems bizarre that we haven't launched a whole host, against all the adoption agencies that are operating within Russia, against all the others who will have children here in school, be playing, maybe doing adoptions for all we know, even though the Russians supposedly ban it. So I would just gently urge that it seems mad that we haven't done more on this given we have it. But then that takes me very clearly to Xinjiang, where we see the exact same thing happening. We see the taking of children, the kidnapping of children, the reindoctrination of children, the readoption of children forcibly against their will and that of their parents. Why, when we've done all the sanctions on Ukraine, are we not doing more on Xinjiang?
So you won't be surprised that I'm not going to be at liberty to share what we might do in the future, but I take absolutely your point about how we can and need to continue to work with those other organisations who can highlight and provide evidence to help us put a case together for sanctions, and we continue to do that across the board. And find ways, we, as I said right at the beginning, we don't have the resource, nor would it necessarily be impactful if we sanctioned everyone and everything. We have to see a real value to it, being able to really make an impact. That's an important part of the purpose of a sanction. But I think around this space and the issue around kidnap of children and so on, we absolutely will take that away and continue to think about where we can impactfully gather the evidence we would need and work on that. But as you'd be unsurprised here, I'm not going to give you a list of where we might be working on it.
But with respect, my question was why we hadn't done more in the past, not what we're looking at doing. The Xinjiang genocide has been taking place for 60 years. This isn't something that's just happened in the last 2 years with Ukraine, for example, even though, again, that is a renewed illegal invasion. So I do struggle that given it's been taking place for 60 years, and that actually we know China does respond to pressure on this. So in 2018, 2019, 2020, when everything was being exposed was taking place in Xinjiang, we did see a change in behaviour. That's the point of sanctions, is to be changed behaviour, not just be punitive. So I do think we are severely lacking when it comes to what we've done on Xinjiang because we've had 60 years. This isn't the last 2 years. And then that leads me very finally to there is one industry where we have failed, despite Parliament asking ad nauseum for us to take action, solar. And that was going to come up because I have been relentless in pointing out that solar is one of the most dirty, complicit industries in Uyghur blood labour. And yet we have done nothing. We have not sanctioned a single company, despite the Foreign Office themselves funding reports that have exposed those companies who are most complicit in this. So how, when we ourselves, if a government has paid for and commissioned these reports, so we know the evidence is there, we know the evidence is sufficient, the Americans have also offered to show evidence, why have we still not sanctioned anyone to do with solar when we know that that's an industry we need to clean up?
I think you're exactly right, Chair. You have highlighted that we have and continue to do work to draw together the evidence that we would need to do. And as I say, I'm never going to talk about future sanctions at this point, but I think your point is well made, and you're absolutely right to continue to highlight those areas where you see and others see areas where we need to continue to think about how we can use the tools that we have, the sanctions regime that we have, which we have expanded exactly to be able to highlight these areas where those behaviours, those ways of life, those abuses of workforce are ones that we consider unacceptable.
I think it's a depressing note to end on because, again, I'm not raising something that's come out of the blue in the last 3 months. The Foreign Office has had years to act on this, not weeks, not months, years, and you could argue decades. So I would just leave with you with a clear message that this committee believes there are still areas in which we have not seen Foreign Office progress where it is frankly unacceptable because we do have the intelligence and evidence, not least because allied partners have told me that they're happy to provide it. So please, can we urgently act on that? But can we thank you ever so much, Minister, for taking the time today. I apologise that we've run over by 5 minutes.
That's all right.
But thank you to you and your officials. And let's hope the sanction strategy proves the success we hope it is. And we look forward to hearing you back in 6 months to check it has been. Thank you ever so much. Order.
Proceeding has ended. The 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 proceeding